So I do want to say welcome to everybody today to this, and we're happy you're able to join us. I know it's a busy time for people. As we begin today's event, I want to say that we respectfully acknowledge the territory in which we gather as the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk, and the island of Newfoundland as the ancestral homelands of the Mi'kmaq and Beothuk. And we'd also like to recognize the Inuit of Nunatsiavut and Nunatuavut, and the Innu of Nitassinan and their ancestors as the original people of Labrador. We strive for respectful relationships with all the peoples of this province as we search for collective healing and true reconciliation and honor this beautiful land together. Once again, welcome to today's event, which gives us the opportunity to think about justice in pandemic times and perhaps also in post-pandemic times. We have two presenters, Sheridan Thompson and Rachel Webb-Jekanowski, each of whom will give a short presentation, followed then by question and answer conversation to talk through ideas and questions they raise, as well as any other thoughts that came to mind while you've been listening. So I want to introduce them both now, and then we'll go into the presentation. So our first presenter is Sheridan Thompson, originally from Winnipeg, Manitoba, who's been living in St. John's for 12 years. Since her arrival to the island, she's been involved in community research and initiatives such as geologist in residence with Fogo Island Shorefast Foundation, experiential coastal tours with Newfoundland and Labrador Environmental Network, and public engagement in partnership with Ocean Learning's Partnership and Coastal Connections. Currently, Sheridan's completing an interdisciplinary PhD program at Memorial University. Her research focuses on coastal change in Iceland, as well as the community's ability to adapt to hazards and disasters such as snowstorms, flooding, and volcanic events. And this work draws on Sheridan's experience in coastal sciences, as well as human/environmental interactions in climate change. And our second presenter is Rachel Webb-Jekanowski, who's an interdisciplinary scholar working between film and media studies, cultural studies, and the environmental/energy humanities. Dr. Jekanowski is an assistant professor at Memorial University's Grenfell campus, and her current book project, Cinemas of Extraction, Land, Resources, Settler Imaginaries, examines environmental and colonial entanglements of 20th century non-theatrical and documentary filmmaking in Canada and the United States. You can find her at rjekanowski.ca, which I will try to type into the chat in a moment, and on Twitter at StaleBreadZine. So welcome to both of you, and thank you both for being part of today's event. And so I'll invite Sheridan to start.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction. And oops. Just correct that. Share screen. Okay. Can everyone see that okay?
Works great.
Thank you. And everyone can hear me okay? Thank you for those who are participating and going to spend the next 10 minutes.
Oh, we've gotten frozen, it seems. Are others frozen?
It might be an issue of Sheridan's Wi-Fi. It might be easier if we turn off our video so that there's less bandwidth use.
That's a good idea. Let's see if we can get Sheridan back. Let's see. Sheridan, are you around? See if I can chat with her. Well, Sheridan's, we've lost Sheridan on the connection, so she will have to rejoin again.
Okay, would it be easier if I go first and then
Sure,
Sheridan can follow?
Sure, that sounds like a good idea.
Okay. Can folks see my slide okay? Great. All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me here today, and thanks for your patience as we flip the order. I'm here to talk about my work as a researcher, but also as an organizer who's been involved with the Low Carbon Research Methods Lab that's being started out at Trent University. And my stake, I guess, in this question of justice is how researchers and educators can build more environmentally just ways of doing research into their everyday practice, and how we can mobilize academics to get involved with the climate movement. So the presentation I have put together here for us is designed as a short introduction to these issues and to some of the methods that we can use. There are a few points where I'm going to have to move quickly so that we can fit it all in, but I'd be happy to speak more about particular issues during the Q&A. So this is designed really as more of like a little like tasty introduction, a little morsel to get us involved. I wish I had more time to unpack this more fully. So as I mentioned at the start, my work as a film and media scholar who's involved with environmental discourses and theories of resource extraction and how this factors into forms of cultural production, brings us back to these questions of how we today can grapple with the impacts of racial capitalism, resource extractivism, colonial land use practices that have all contributed to the climate crisis that we now find ourselves in. And without simplifying things, I do believe that the climate crisis is probably the biggest existential threat that we're going to be facing during our lifetimes. So given this, I think we do have to look at the climate emergency as all hands on deck. We have to do what we can within our everyday lives and within our work practice to not only reduce carbon emissions, but push for viable public policy changes that can shepherd along the energy transition that we are currently in the midst of, and that will continue sort of, I don't want to say regardless, but we are in the middle of this moment, this climate transition, which offers challenges, but also opportunities for rethinking the ways that we do work in the university and also as academics. So with this in mind, and with this very expansive understanding of what climate justice is decolonization, it is disability justice, it is feminist, it is a borderless world. How can we then, as academics, get involved in this movement? And I mean, the short answer is lots of ways. There are lots of ways we can mobilize. We can do this through activism. We can do this by integrating climate change into our teaching and our program curriculum within universities. But of course, many of us are doing work that is not explicitly environmental or explicitly climate focused. And I think that opens up new opportunities then for thinking about how our methods can be ways of doing climate work. So many of us are in our research outputs or our theoretical or conceptual frameworks already engaging with environment. But what the low carbon research lab is trying to do is build out our toolbox that we can use for doing more intersectional work around climate issues. So to briefly introduce this term, climate or low carbon research methods, this is a term that describes the way that we can switch from high carbon emission forms of research, so using transportation methods and telecommunication methods that create more climate emissions, to a low carbon series of practices within our everyday research. And this can occur kind of in two fronts. The first is the actual methods by which we do our research. So what is the scope of our research project? How are we defining our research questions, and therefore conducting the work? What archives are we using? What forms of ethnographic methods are we using, for instance? Are we traveling far distances to do this work? Are we doing a lot of heavy coding, which is going to create more carbon emissions on the telecommunications end? Are we, as scholars, studying or engaging with communities far afield from where we're located, therefore raising issues of flying and transportation. And then once we have produced our research and we have our research findings, then there's the question of how we're actually disseminating this work. And now that we are in year 2 of the pandemic, many of us are familiar with online conferences or hybrid options or publishing in open access digital journals. So low carbon dissemination methods are very familiar to us, but as we see large institutions like universities, like governments try to transition back to entirely in-person ways of doing things, it raises this challenge of how we're going to continue to build in hybrid options of meeting as academics, of sharing our research, and of building collaborative forms of research exchange. So once again, the goal of looking at research from this climate lens, how we can engage with decarbonization and engage with forms of equity around environmental issues. This is all part of building a toolbox that we can use as scholars and integrate into various research projects. So as I mentioned, I'm involved with the Low Carbon Research Lab, which is housed at Trent University. And I won't go too far into this group right now, but I just want to introduce it as a network of scholars, many of whom are emerging scholars who are interested in how climate change alters not only what we study, but how we're going to study it. And this idea of an energy transition for academic methods is really at the heart of what this lab is trying to do, and many of the events and workshops that the lab is piloting currently. And the goal here is to not only shift how individuals do work, but shifting the academic norms and practices through which we function in the academy, and shifting this towards lower or reduced carbon emissions, localized forms of research, collaborative research, and more equitable practices that can radically restructure the university as we now understand it. And I will add that this restructuring always already has more just labor practices and disability justice built into it. And the end goal of much of this work, of this structural change, is to decarbonize and decolonize these systems. And I'll add that looking at the university and looking at the methods that we use as researchers as part of this bigger climate transition might seem a bit esoteric, or maybe just seems like nerdy the way academics tend to focus on ourselves. But I think it really opens an opportunity for asking, what role does the university play within public society? In provinces like Newfoundland and Labrador, for instance, where we only have one university, we only have Memorial, universities play an enormous role in training the youth, in shifting public discourse, in participating in the development of public policy, of minting politicians and the next generation of engineers. So we do need to think critically about how universities can get on board with shepherding this energy transition, with shepherding society towards a low carbon and decarbonized future, but also internally within these institutions, reconceptualizing work and shifting from current practices to a less extractivist way of engaging with the communities that we're located in and engaging with our energy systems. So to find out more about the group, you can find them online. There are several events coming up in February. So if you're interested, I'd strongly encourage you to check these out. And it is a very loose affiliation of researchers, and there's a great deal of interdisciplinary work being done in this lab. There are a lot of anthropologists, for instance, a lot of humanities scholars like myself, media scholars, environmental historians, and others sort of working between the humanities and social sciences, not all of whom are doing explicitly environmental work, I'll add. So to just briefly introduce some of these actual practices that we can build into our toolbox as scholars. As I mentioned, there is this transition from high carbon to low carbon forms of transportation. And it really boils down to reducing our flying, using public transit when possible, carpooling, reducing the number of trips or regrouping the number of research and work trips that we're taking. And of course, in a place like Newfoundland and Labrador, we don't have a lot of other options other than flying or driving. So even trying to do this work has its different challenges depending on where we're located in the world. And the burden is often shifted unjustly onto international students or international workers who do, of course, have family scattered around the world. So there are always these intersectional concerns built into these, but at the end of the day, shifting to really reduce flying is one of the biggest ways that we can reduce global carbon emissions. Colleagues of mine are also working to restructure projects around local archival collections or digital archives to reduce research travel. We can also shift from solo authorship projects to more collaborative projects that redistribute opportunities and workloads to build collaborations, especially with local informants, graduate students, and local researchers. And this is an issue that many of my colleagues in anthropology are working on right now, how to do work in places like the United States and Canada, often in their home communities in the global South, while not flying to their sites of research. Many colleagues are also looking at ways of integrating a carbon analysis into our research project. And a carbon analysis describes the way that we can account for the carbon emissions through which we do our work as a way to foreground environmental impacts as one of the many ethical practices by which we're doing our work. So colleagues who are pushing on this front are often talking about this in parallel with a typical ethics review that we would do in the social sciences, that we can also do a carbon review of our work. There's also practices of slow scholarship, physically slowing down, reducing expectations on academics' workloads, and extending the time through which we do projects to better open up avenues for disabled scholars to participate, to shift our understandings of what productivity is supposed to be in the university. And then finally, partnering with institutions or organizations that are already doing sustainability and decolonizing work in a reciprocal, respectful way, and then shifting the ways that we meet as scholars and share our work to regional spoken wheel conferences or online hybrid conferences. And again, all of these different actions are trying to build in more options for doing our work that can challenge the norms of flying a lot, of being hyper productive, of foregrounding academic knowledge and exchange before thinking about academic workers as people who are in their communities, who have the right to a work-life balance and are dealing with childcare and dealing with different accessibility concerns. By building in a low carbon analysis, we can also use that as an avenue through which we build in just labor practices, build in feminist and anti-racist forms of work. It opens the doors to thinking more expansively about justice and equity. So my time is almost up. I'm just going to conclude by saying that there are some institutions already leading this work, including the University of British Columbia, which has issued recommendations to reduce flying, but also to change promotion and tenure requirements and push for institutional change through universities as a way to then push for policy change more broadly. And I think this is really where we have to put our work, our emphasis, not only in how we as individual scholars can take these actions in our own work, but how these individual actions can push for collective change within the educational sector, while always thinking about different localized solutions, given that we are all working within differently resourced institutions and within different parts of the world that have access to different transportation options, for instance. So I'll leave it there and say that these slides I can make these slides available if Sonia thinks that can be useful for us, which outlines some more kind of structural changes that we can take. And there are also many further resources I'd be happy to direct your attention to. Thank you, and I'm really excited to hear what you think about this.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for that presentation, which gives lots to think about. We've got Sheridan back. Sheridan, I'm sorry we lost you for a little bit. If we can all move to a stop video just to reduce the load for Sheridan to make sure that that works. Sheridan, are you okay? Are you around?
Yes, I am. I'm sorry, I got kicked off.
Okay. I will shut down my video, so that leaves you room to turn on yours.
Okay, and my screen just reduced, and I don't know quite. Just give me one moment, please. Okay. Start video. 1 second. So it's just said participant sharing screen has been disabled.
To make you a co-host again. Sorry, my apologies.
Thank you. No worries.
There we go.
Okay. Thank you so much, Rachel. That was really interesting. I'm so sorry I missed the introduction. Okay, there we go. Okay, so thank you very much for those of you who are joining us today to hear me speak a bit about my project. It is through Memorial University. As Sonia mentioned, I'm an interdisciplinary PhD student, but my research is in Iceland. So today I'm going to talk a bit about some of the strains or the challenges that I've come up against with respect to the interview process that I've been undertaking for this project. But first, I'm going to go into a bit more about the project. So for the next 10 to 15 minutes, I'm just going to give you an idea give you context of the project. As I said, it's interdisciplinary. And I'm looking at Iceland, which is a rapidly evolving island, but I'm specifically looking at coastal change. And I'm looking to the communities who live along that coast and accessing a little bit of local knowledge to understand how they've been adapting to this rapidly changing island and coast for over a millennia. So one thing about my research is it is a transdisciplinary research, which here I would define in brief, it's treating local knowledge equal to that of academic knowledge. So that is something that's intertwined with the whole of the project through the whole of the process and in every nook and cranny I can possibly find. And it can be challenging already because I live in Newfoundland and Icelanders live in Iceland. So I've already had to do my best to ensure that that process, that local knowledge is integrated with this process. And one way in which I've been trying to do that is through my interviews, in-depth qualitative in-depth interviews is one of the methods that I've chosen to understand the human environmental interactions along the southeast coast of Iceland. But yes, since the pandemic started, it's definitely, I already didn't have a huge background in the interviewing process, and so it was already a strain or a bit of a challenge, but under the pandemic conditions, this definitely emphasized the strain and challenges. And then I'll conclude with a few remarks or observations I made thus far. So just to let you know a little bit about the project that I'm undertaking in Iceland. Iceland is a very northern island. It's roughly the same size as Newfoundland, 106,000 square kilometers, whereas Newfoundland's 109,000 square kilometers. The very northern part of it grazes the Arctic Circle. So it's a northern island, and because of its latitude, as well as its position over the mid-oceanic ridge and a hotspot, it's been rapidly building. It's a really young island. It's about 18 million years old. And relative to, say, Newfoundland, has rock that's more than 700 million years old. It's a volcanic island, so it's made out of a really porous rock or a very easily eroded rock. It's volcanic rock, and some of it is harder on the outer edges. And then along the mid-oceanic ridge and the hot spot, these are where the hot zones are and where you'll find volcanoes like Grimsvötn, which is just beneath Vatnajökull, which is the second largest glacier in Europe, which is currently retreating and melting because of climate change. So what you have is it's being melted internally by the volcanoes. And when it's melted internally, it creates these mass flood, these flooding events, which are called yocalypts. So what this does is the caldera beneath the volcano will fill up with meltwater. Meltwater, once it gets to a certain volume and density, caps over the gases within the volcano, and the gases eventually explode out and push the meltwater out outside of the volcano, but beneath the glacier, and it goes down to the ocean, and it creates deposition and debris and accretion along the coastline. So building up the coastline in certain ways, but also eroding it, because this is a flash flood of great magnitude. So there's that. We have volcanoes and glaciers that are contributing to hazards and disasters along this coastline, because there is a major road, especially currently now, that goes along the south coast that's used for tourism primarily. But these are events that have been happening for, since 930 AD, since Icelanders settled there, and they've been adapting to them all these years. So I'm curious to know how they've been adapting to them. But these events and these processes that are acting on their coasts are actually on the increase because of climate change. And Iceland, not unlike other northern regions, are the most vulnerable to climate change right now. We'll see the impact of climate change in northern regions much more quickly than we will to our more southern region where we are right now. So externally, what's melting the glacier is climate change. And so while this the glaciers are melting, externally they're losing their density, and they're becoming, rather than 600 meters to 1,000 kilometers or to 1 kilometer, they're reducing quite a bit. And then we have rebound of the land. So the land is coming up, and what happens is along the coast is we have also rebound. The coast is actually popping out of the water anywhere from 6 centimeters to 20 centimeters per annum. So it's quite a bit. So the coast is actually building up in certain spots, but it's also eroding in certain spots because of storm events that are increasing in intensity and frequency. So Iceland actually gets a lot of similar storm systems that we get here in Newfoundland. And so the coast is changing rapidly, but yet, and Icelanders are trying to anticipate what those changes will be. So I wanted to know how Icelanders have been adapting to this for over 1,000 years. I consider they've been quite effective. They're only a population of 360 to 370,000 people on a reasonably small island, and they're doing a pretty good job. They're at adapting to all of these processes that are occurring along their coast as coastal communities. So I entered into this research with a bit of a coastal science background, but I wanted it to be community research. So I didn't want to come in and be tunnel vision, to be that scientist that says, well, here are your problems. I wanted to work immediately with the coastal communities to understand what they felt the important issues were. And I did want to share my knowledge. For instance, many of the Icelanders I've spoken to are very aware of the processes, hazards such as volcanic events, and very aware of them to the land. They're very aware of their fisheries and the changes to their fisheries off the water, but they're not, a lot of them are very aware of the changes that are occurring right at the coast. So I play this small little glued piece to that. But really, overall, I want the communities to inform this process. I want the end result of the PhD research to help them in a way that is meaningful to them from their own worldviews. So one of the ways in which I've hoped to do this is through qualitative in-depth interviews, which are a wonderful process, but they're not it's not like a survey, it's not checkpoints, it's already a very in-depth process. And in order to have get good information from it, you must build up good rapport with your participants or those who choose to participate. And in order to do that, you have to spend time. So I've been in Iceland a few times, not for lengthy periods of time, but I visited in 2011, 2015, 2017, 2018, and 2019. And I did develop some good relations to that time, in that time. So what was good is that I visited Iceland several times, and I created these relations before the pandemic. That served me well because I already had relationships. I already developed relationships with some Icelanders who were very interested in my research and potentially interested in being an interviewee. So that was a positive going into the pandemic. But there were some challenges that I knew already without the pandemic going into the interview process. And several of those challenges actually haven't gone away. They've been emphasized by the pandemic. And then on top of that, there have been additional challenges because it's not that my research is just remote now, but it's remote in a pandemic. So there's been additional challenges. So I knew that going in that I'd not had a background in interviewing. I did have some training in communication and just deeper listening, but I knew you really do need body language for an in-depth qualitative interview, because you either have to back off when you're talking to your participants because you're talking about hazards and disasters, or you lean in when they potentially have something to say, but they need to articulate it and you give them that opportunity. So those techniques in interviewing I was aware of going in could be problematic. Qualitative in-depth interviews are time intensive, and they become that much more so during the pandemic because I'm trying not to exhaust my participants. So I have 3 meetings, 45 minutes each, to sort of take them off of screen and not overdo it, because I know as in their lives, as it is in my life, I'm on the screen a lot. So I'm trying to make the interviews a little easier. But even without the pandemic, which is being emphasized by the pandemic, I'm relying on the people I've met already, and I would almost equal these people as my friends. So some of the interviews, or much of the interviews, is prone to bias. And because I'm relying on my friends that much more during the pandemic, that's that much more prone to bias. With qualitative, in-depth interviews, it's because you're not checking boxes and asking specific questions. It's not as easy to find the themes or that thread that's common between all the participants, but that's okay because I'm more interested in their stories of the land or their stories with nature. It's been the added to the list that's made it difficult. This interviewing process is there are times, as we know, in Memorial, we weren't permitted to do research abroad. And so that's cut into my time of being present with the community members and hopefully making this transdisciplinary research. That's been a little frustrating. Adjustment to technologies. I've definitely had to adjust. I can't use Zoom because I don't have account, so I can't record my interviews, and I'm getting used to WebEx. But WebEx isn't a commonly used form of video time that my Icelander participants use. So there's been an adjustment, and it's been frustrating for some of my participants. Screen time fatigue, I already mentioned, and I've tried to mitigate that by taking certain measures of reducing the time, the interview process. Remote recruitment, because I want to reduce the bias to some of the work that I'm doing. I want to recruit remotely, but the truth is I'm very concerned about reaching out to people without being there present because they can't see my body language. They don't really know me. I could put up a flyer to try to recruit through social media, but that's a very impersonal, and that's a very poor way to build up rapport for qualitative in-depth interviews. And as well, this month I was hoping to interview, but because of Omicron, I'm not going near anyone because I don't know how it's straining their lives personally. I'm just really removed from their personal experience in Iceland and how this pandemic is impacting them. But coming to some, when I was thinking about this presentation, there were some positives about this that really added benefits to my research. And one of them was I'm that much more sensitive to what my participants or interviewees might be going through, because we are in a shared global pandemic. It's not Iceland's pandemic. It's not Newfoundland's pandemic or endemic. it's a shared pandemic. So I've become extra reflexive about the potential strain that they would be under. And so I think it's increased my sensitivity and to what their vulnerabilities might be. And actually, they are pretty sensitive to how this might be straining me. Frustrations with technologies. It has been frustrating, but I have to say my participants are they're fully committed. So we actually address these problems together, and that builds up our rapport. And not only does it build up our rapport, but in a small way, when you want to treat local knowledge equal to that of academic knowledge, when I'm not good at my technology, I come down here a bit and they help me out, we come here. So we build up a rapport, and that's one of the small ways, that's one of those nooks and crannies where I feel the transdisciplinary research is being conducted. Time intensive, and that sensitivity to each other's lives during this time, it means our interviewing process is much more authentic, and so are the stories. So these are the ways in which the pandemic has contributed positively to this research process, even if it's created a great deal of strain. And I'm just interested in hearing any discussion about this. And tack fyr. Thank you for joining me and listening to me speak. And I hope I didn't go over my time.
Thank you so much, Sheridan. That was great.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was really interesting. And having both presentations together was very interesting as well. If we could get you to stop the share screen, then we can go, so everybody can see everybody more bigly. Shall I say more bigly? But what I liked about the two presentations is that we brought together humanities, social sciences, and sciences all coming together and talking through about things like collaboration, community, relationship building was part of both your presentations. So I'm really interested in hearing what our audience members might be thinking at this point. Please feel free, if you don't feel like putting up your and speaking yourselves, if you want to put it into the chat, that would be great. So I'll open it up to what people would like to ask. Sam says, thanks for great presentations. But if anybody has questions of each other even.
I can say something. Sheridan, thank you, or both Rachel and Sheridan, thank you for both of y'all's presentations. Sheridan, with your case, I'm sure like so many people can relate to that, like on a lot of different levels. I can definitely relate to it because of trying to do field work during a pandemic. I was lucky enough to get to do 1 week of I had like good success field research in Newfoundland because I'm working with fishers in Newfoundland, and like the stress of like having the shortened time period, but also like the uncertainty, like right after that happened, Omicron came. So like everything was shut down. So I'd planned to do like more trips in the winter, but have been since unable to do more. But like even like a lot of fishers will be like, why are you wearing a mask? Why aren't you wearing a mask? Like it's like you can never get it right. You can never know what their expectations are. So like the pressure on like us as researchers is so much greater. And like there is literally no way I can remotely recruit people for doing interviews with fishers because there's so much research fatigue here. And like I have to go to them, and like basically every like 5 people that I ask to do an interview, I'm gonna get like 1 person to agree. So there's no way I'm gonna put up a flyer. Or like I even went on CBC, the broadcast, and like I got 1 person response, and it was not a fishing person. So like there's no chance for remote recruitment. That's not a thing. And yeah, so I just wanted to say basically I definitely understand what you're saying. I think it puts a huge amount of pressure on us as researchers, and everyone's like stressed out, not just us, but the participants. But yeah, from my perspective as a researcher, it definitely has like been stressful.
Yeah, I really do empathize with that, Lillian. And that's the thing, like when I've been hypersensitive when I speak to the people. I don't know what your interviews are, if you're doing focus groups, if you're doing surveys, but I did develop a relationship with my Icelandic participants beforehand. So we had that friendship. So that actually has decreased my stress a bit. But now I'm getting to the point where I know that I have to reach out more, and I'm at the point where I have to be creative about that. So I'm sure that list of, oh, how difficult is this during a pandemic list will get longer in that process. But at the same time, I might be able to go to Iceland in the time to come. And if I can, that's going to be my preference, because it's a great strain on not on just me, but my participants.
I'm interested there in both of your comments, because I think a lot of grad students especially have had to transition projects very, very quickly in order to manage the whole change now. And I wonder also, in relation to Rachel's points around how can we move to low carbon methods, that is also a huge transition that requires so much vulnerability on the part of researchers, but also on the part of participants as they get used to different ways of operating, possibly different ways of operating and managing relationships, managing encounters, managing interviews, all those kinds of things. I think is not, it's one of those things that it's also part of this constant transition that we're in as a result of COVID, as well as we try to manage relationships in totally different ways than we've ever had to manage relationships before, right? In many cases, how is it that we maintain networks even outside of research in pandemic times when we're all isolated in various sorts of ways? I will mention that Rachel has put a few links in the chat to the work some work that she's published publicly, sort of public access work available online if people want to check that kind of thing out. I'm going to see if anybody else has any questions now. Thank you, Lillian, for your contribution.
Can I just, I guess, respond to Lillian's comments?
Go for it.
I mean, I'm also empathetic of what you're both going through. But like listening to this, I find incredibly, frustrating, obviously. But I think like the missing piece that we need to talk about is how the institutions are also letting graduate students down and letting early career researchers down. And I don't want to, only kick this up the academic ladder and then say like it's all the administration's fault. But bigger picture is governments and universities need to supply more funding so that this work can be done in the slow way that it needs to be done, and that there's more care being taken for both researchers and participants. Because as an international student who was always on visas, worrying about whether or not I could finish my work within that time period, and now knowing what so many people are going through with the pandemic, these kind of artificial financial restraints or artificial time restraints on our program durations create all of these trickle down effects on researchers and on participants that, as you both have pointed to, is incredibly stressful. And like the nuanced long-term relationship building is what is often impacted, let alone people's mental health and emotional health, by these artificial restraints. So for me, this is where I see something like slow scholarship coming in, or better public funding for institutions and for researchers, so that there's just more time and care and resources built into systems, so that we don't have to deal with the individual burden of something like a pandemic on our own shoulders. Like, this is where institutions need to be serving us better.
Thanks for those observations as well. And I also want to point back to Sheridan's points earlier that while there are challenges, there were also some interesting possibilities that came out of the Zoom, you know what I mean? The online interactions, particularly around questions of vulnerability and perhaps recognizing some vulnerabilities that we wouldn't otherwise recognize in more quote unquote conventional approaches to research. I have a question and a comment from Sam in the audience, and Sam says, Sheridan and Rachel, I think both of you in different ways are talking about using remote technologies like Zoom that we're using now as a way to keep doing research during the pandemic, and also as a way to practice low carbon research. I'm wondering about the infrastructure of remote technologies and whether they are actually lower carbon data centers, colonial land relations of data centers, and the materials needed for this type of infrastructure, And then what kinds of relationships do technologies like Zoom draw us into might be another way to say it. Relationships with those we do research with and relationships with low carbon methods. So having a think about the, I guess the impact of this technology that we're using right now. I don't know if either of you want to have a bit of a think about that. Oh, I've got two more messages after that.
Yeah, thank you, Sam, for bringing up this question. I think it's incredibly important, and there are a lot of scholars working on data infrastructures and digital media who can give you the research answer better than I can. I'd particularly refer you to Mel Hogan's research, but the quick takeaway is that as so much of our lives transition to digital technologies and these kinds of digitally mediated spaces, it does raise a real concern about the location of data centers, the enormous and growing carbon footprint and environmental footprints of not only the data centers themselves, but also all of the rare earth mining that goes into creating these forms of technologies. So all this to say, a just energy transition requires us to, look at all sectors of our media usage and sort of our structured society. So there are many people who are fighting, for instance, to yes, have more hybrid options, but also have hybrid options that are lower carbon emissions. So in a space like this, one of the practices that we've been using in like low carbon spaces is that everyone turns their cameras off except for the speaker, just to reduce the number of emissions, in this one interaction. And yes, it's like only a drop in the pool, but if we shift our expectations of what collaboration and like what participation looks like, that's all part and parcel of, I guess, like of creating these structural shifts. So, that's one option or one action. Another interesting design solution is actually shifting our expectations of what high quality and like glossy publications look like to create more lo-fi design. So there's this amazing like low tech solution model of design where what a website looks like or what a digital publication will look like will shift depending on how much bandwidth you have to work with and how, like, where your energy is coming from. So some media scholars are starting to pilot creating their own like solar panel servers or trying to source their energy from energy mixes that have transitioned away from carbon emissions, or otherwise reducing the bandwidth of their digital interactions to reduce the reliance on carbon emissions and fossil fuels. So I can just pull up my one of my slides again, this one. I just want to show us what this website looks like, because this is an example of this low carbon design, where the actual look of the website will shift from day to day, depending on how much sunlight there is to power the solar panel that is running this website. And depending on what, how much bandwidth the user, the media user has to access it. And part of this work is not only about foregrounding visually our energy use, but also, again, asking that question of how our expectations of high emissions research and high emissions like research publications are really centered around the industrialized global north. Because if you're working in a place where you might be using your cell phone to access this material, or you're in a remote area where you don't have very strong bandwidth or access to much bandwidth at all, you can't be accessing websites that have all of these extra plugins and take more bandwidth to function. So it's also about shifting our collective norms and our expectations, and building in more lo-fi or like DIY options.
Great, thank you for that thorough response. Sharon, did you want to add anything to that?
Thank you so much, Rachel, for that. Yeah, I feel that the institutions contributing, because this is kind of a really steep learning curve, and it's pointing out to the problems we already had previously. So I like what Rachel's saying for that. I feel more of what I've been focused on, especially with transdisciplinary research, what pandemic has done to me is it's made me more creative and more sensitive in a relational way. So a little more on the ground, like we do need more of the space and time to create these relationships. I don't know if we can talk about transdisciplinary research in the academic arena without talking about, are we giving the breadth and the space for researchers to adapt and be reflexive in a way of what that actually means? Can I really be inclusive of community guiding the process within that framework? And I do feel that that was always there prior to the academic or within my experience, and that the walls just have squeezed in a bit on me as a researcher. So I do think on the ground, I've become like a better acquainted on the ground dealing with people. I guess with my conversations in the interview, I don't really enjoy these remote interviews. There's not the body language there. I don't have the relationship with these people. So how can I be supported during this time to have better relationships and glean better information from these communities if I'm going to claim it's transdisciplinary research? So I just wanted to contribute. Thank you, Rachel. I just wanted to say.
Both of you make really good observations around institutional expectations and also institutional support. I mentioned just now when you were talking, Sheridan, creative, sensitive, and relational way, right? That kind of work, building relationships in those ways takes time. It takes a lot of time. And as you point out, these issues were already present in the institution, but the pandemic has highlighted them, right? So how do we build relationships? How do we work together in ways that are nurturing and generative and sustainable in many ways? And those are larger institutional questions. And funding for 4 years that ends at the end of the 4 years it may not be possible, and particularly in the current pandemic times. We've come to 11:56 on my computer, which suggests to me that we probably need to close our event down, although this could be fodder for endless longer conversations, particularly over coffee and lunch and all those kinds of things. So at a time when the weather is more amenable and we can sit outside or go for a walk, that kind of thing, and it's not -15 outside, then I would invite everybody to continue these conversations and to think about how we might implement both in our local environments, but also institutionally more broadly. So I wanted to thank both of you for sharing your work today, and but also sharing this space with us right now. I wanted to go back to these early days of the pandemic when we did have this thought of what can change? And now as we're 2 years in and everybody's exhausted and overwhelmed, how can we continue those conversations and move further forward on that? And what might justice look like, as not just now, but also as we move forward. I will say finally that we do have an event coming up on February 18th that will likely be of interest to, I don't know if I have, I don't know if I won't even look to try and share it right now. To people who are here, we have an online workshop on writing for social justice with Elle Jones, who is a poet, an abolitionist, and also a professor based in Halifax, and she will be joining us for an online workshop. That's February 18th, and information will be going out on that through the Nexus website, and if you're interested in registering for that. So I want to thank everybody for coming today and for being part of today's conversation, and especially to Sheridan and Rachel for sharing their knowledge with us and their experiences with us. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us. And thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you.